Soil health and preservation. So first of all, the plant roots allow air and water into the soil. Plants are a highly effective carbon sink as well, so they're good for taking carbon down into the soil. Plants cover and protect the soil. They collect and hold water, so without plants we lose all the beneficial effects of water, and water actually then starts to create problems. So it completely turns the situation around, whereas when we have plants they can utilise that water to grow more plant matter, and they reduce compaction, so they keep the soil open and stop it from being compacted, which is a particular problem with horses in particular, in that they compact soil. So once they overeat and then their weight starts to compact the soil. So when horses are on pasture, they have better circulation and better hoof quality due to more movement. The horse is designed so that every step he takes, the hoof acts as like a pump and helps the fluids to circulate around the body, like blood and lymphatic fluid and so on. So that's the way the horse is made to be. So he's meant to be moving for many, many hours a day. Whilst the horse is grazing, he's breathing cleaner air than a stabled horse, and he's draining his airways naturally. So having the head down in that grazing position is also extremely important for horses. As I said earlier, they have large and delicate lungs, and that is offset to a large extent because when a horse is grazing, he's cleaning those lungs. So that's a natural way that he has of cleaning his lungs. He's following a natural pattern of eating, browsing and foraging. So he's getting to choose what he wants from what he doesn't want and act like a natural horse in many respects. Horses that graze don't develop behavioural disorders, and horses with them tend to reduce these behaviours. So once a horse does things like crib, bite, weave, those types of things, they are actually hardwired into his brain. They become just like habits in humans. You always actually have them. It's just that unlike a human where you can actually make a conscious decision to, I won't do that anymore because it's not good for me, horses don't do that. They're not able to do that. So whenever they feel the need to carry out that behaviour, they will do that. But by replacing the need to do that, then we can make it so the horse hardly ever carries out those behaviours. So horses will do them less and less over time, and it may get so that you never see those behaviours again, even though they're still hardwired into his brain. But you can usually reduce them. So more benefits of pasture are that it provides essential roughage for horses. It reduces the feed bill as it's a relatively cheap form of feed. It's a lot cheaper than buying in feed, so it's a good investment is to have good pasture on your land. Properties with good pasture usually have a higher value, so it's a good investment as well because it will mean that your property will be worth more. And it's an excellent feed source for most horses, but that's where it starts to get more complicated. Especially for horse owners. So the problem is that horse owners, if you think about your average farmer, they might have 100 or several hundred head of exactly the same class of animals. So they might, for instance, have yearling steers who were all born within days or at the most weeks of each other, who all weigh the same within a few pounds of each other, all have virtually the same feed requirement. As horse owners, we usually, we might have one of these, and she might be sort of 25 and not doing much at all. We might have a crossbred, say, horse. We might have a neurotic thoroughbred and a big fat warm blood. All sorts of things, a quarter horse as well, all with completely different feed requirements. And not only are they all different body shapes and sizes, different ages and different workloads. So that is what makes managing horses a lot more complicated for us as horse owners than, for instance, for a farmer who has much more standardised animals to look after. So improved, I don't know what you call it here in the USA, but in Australia we talk about improved grassland and native pasture and so on. So the reason I put improved in inverted commas is because if you were a farmer, improved grassland is the way to go, but for horse owners, improved grassland is a big problem because improved means that it's had lots of high sugar grasses introduced into it basically. So that's why I put it in inverted commas, because for horse owners it's not a good idea. So the reason that pastures end up becoming improved is because farmers need these usually higher energy grasses because their aim is to put weight on cattle as quickly as possible so that then those animals can be processed for food. As horse owners, especially our modern horses who are virtually, as I said, nearly always couch potatoes, then that's a huge problem, because what's happening is that we're feeding these horses who have virtually, very low feed energy requirements on these very high energy grasses. So that's why we're now seeing so many problems with horses. And that's because, especially in this last sort of century, what's happened is that grasses that used to be thought of as good for horses and were good for horses, so like 100 or 200 years ago, if you were feeding your horses on ryegrass, for instance, those high energy grasses, that kind of thing, at the same time those horses were working for a living, but those ryegrasses weren't developed either. So the two together meant that the horse could utilise all that energy he was getting, and it usually had to be fed on lots of grain as well to supplement that, because it still wasn't enough. Now things have completely changed, because now those grasses have been improved to a point where some of them are 35–40% sugar, and at the same time what our horse does for a living has gone right down this way as well, in terms of the horse rarely works for a living. Even when it's what we consider work, it's not really work. So for instance, if you ride your horse in an arena for an hour a day, that's not work. That's just, not at all. Especially if the other 23 hours a day, he's standing in a dry lot or whatever. He really needs to be doing a lot more than that. And it's very difficult to actually do that. So instead what we need to do is make sure that we feed our horses on lower energy feed. It's complicated because all the time we're being pressurised to feed our horses on higher energy feed. Feed companies don't do research into grass and hay. They do research into grains and that type of thing. So of course, that's what they're going to tell you your horse needs. And in some cases, that's what your horse does need, but you just need to be aware that, that you need to be aware that they might be telling that your horse needs more energy than he actually needs. You need to be aware that your horse is probably not working as hard as you think he is. So modern improved grasses and selectively bred grasses are a problem for modern couch potato horses, because they've been developed for beef and dairy cows, both who have an outlet for all that energy, whereas our modern horse doesn't. And these improved grasses, such as ryegrasses and so on, have high sugar levels, fructans and other sugars, and high starch levels. And yet, if you pick up most books on horse pasture management, it will tell you that you need, for your horses, you need these high energy grasses and so on, and clovers and that type of thing. Also, C3 grasses, which are what you'll get a lot of in this kind of temperate climate, compared to, say, the tropical types of grasses. You might get some of them in this climate, but the C3 grasses are even more dangerous. So the things like ryegrass and so on, because they actually have, one of their forms of sugar is fructan, and fructan is implicated in laminitis. So it's much more dangerous. Those grasses are much more dangerous in terms of laminitis. Whereas those tropical types of grasses, they don't usually have fructan in them, so they're actually safer in that respect. But your horse can still get way overweight and so on. So it's very complicated for horse owners. There's a lot of misconceptions about grasses as well. So for instance, grass doesn't have to be lush behind sugars in starch. In fact, when we deliberately overgraze pasture and keep it really short, thinking that we will reduce our horse's intake, what we actually do is increase the sugar in that grass per mouthful. And our horse is beautifully equipped to eat short grass. So when we turn a horse out onto a paddock of really short grass, thinking that we will make him slimmer, and then wonder why he just keeps getting fatter, it's because he's got teeth in his mouth that enable him to eat really short grass, and he actually likes really short grass, because per mouthful, it's very high in sugar. So that's a complete opposite of what we've always thought about horses, and I think that comes from the management. That idea comes from the management of cattle. If you wanted to make a cow thinner, you'd put her in a paddock of really short grass, and she would eventually lose weight. Do that with a horse, and unless the grass is virtually non-existent, that horse won't lose any weight, because that grass per mouthful is very high in sugar. Also, grass after freezing nights. So in this climate in particular, you'll all have noticed how, in spring and autumn in particular, that's the most dangerous time for laminitis, because what happens is that the plant normally, the sugar levels that it builds up through the day, when you get a sunny day such as today, when it's a warm evening, the plant uses that sugar to regrow overnight. So all day long it collects sugar, and then all through the night it utilises that sugar to regrow. So it starts off next morning normally all low in sugar. That's why with laminitic horses, the safest time to turn them out is usually in the morning up until about lunchtime. But If it's a cold night or even a freezing night, what happens is the plant doesn't use that sugar, it stays dormant that night. So it starts off next morning already high in sugar, then the sun comes out, because it always does when you've got that frosty weather, you get sunny days and frosty nights. Next morning it's already high in sugar, the sun comes out, builds the sugar levels up even higher. And that's why we now know that laminitic horses are at a lot more risk particularly in spring and autumn, because that's when you're getting those frosty nights and sunny days, especially, there can be like a few week period at either end, and so those laminitic horses are particularly at risk in those times of the year. So if you have those kind of horses, you need to really watch them at those times of the year. So the sugar and starch content of grasses is affected by the species. So for instance, the native grasses in any country tend to, because they're unimproved, are usually much lower in sugar. So natives are usually a really good way to go. How much sunlight there is. So on a cloudy day, the grasses will be safer in terms of sugar levels than on a sunny day. The temperature, because grasses, again, certain grasses stop growing at certain temperatures and so on. Water status, stage of growth and so on. So the sugar levels in the pasture are varying all the time. There's no way that as a horse owner you can look at a paddock and say exactly what's going to be in there. All you can do is learn what you can about grasses and try and make a good guesstimate basically. But as I say, things like frosty nights and so on in particular are dangerous for laminitic horses. So horse care systems, what's ideal for horses is grassy paddocks with water, shade and shelter, and other horses for companionship. So that's what we're trying to provide for as much of the time as possible. But what, as I say, what we have to acknowledge is that that might only be say before half of the day or a few hours a day or whatever. But what we should be aiming for is that when the horses are turned out, it's for quality grazing time, rather than that we're turning them out into pastures that have degraded and therefore it's just more of the same. For instance, in a dry lot overnight, we turn them out into a pasture that's overgrazed anyway, and you know, if anything, he's either grazing very stressed grasses when he's out in the pasture, or there's no real grass to eat at all anyway, in which case there's no point turning them out at all. So, but the smaller the property, the more intensive management system will be required. So as I say, we need to acknowledge that if we only have 5, 10 or 20 or 50 acres or whatever, depending on how many horses we have, we need to acknowledge that we'll need a pretty intensive management system. But, you know, just like if you keep any large amount of animals on a small area. So, but when you know what you're doing, it's not that hard to do. I'm going to be talking about a system where the horses do most of the work themselves. So at certain times of the year, the horses will probably need to be confined either for their own sake or the sake of the land. Now, as a horse owner, you're always actually juggling 4 factors. Now, most horse owners already think about the 2 factors of the horse themselves, as in, as a horse owner, without even realising it, every day you look at that horse, you're thinking subconsciously usually, has he put weight on or has he lost weight? So every day on a daily basis you tend to be looking at that and making minor adjustments so that you keep him as much as possible on a reasonably even keel. But what we also need to be doing is looking at the land on a daily basis and deciding, has that paddock, has that pasture had enough grazing, or does it need a little bit more? So you're always actually juggling 4 factors of horses getting too fat or horses getting too thin, and paddocks becoming overgrazed or needing more grazing. They're the 4 factors that you have to juggle as a horse owner, horse property manager. So it makes it quite complicated to do that, but as I say, it's easy when you know how. So therefore, what you actually need, and many people already have this situation, is you need somewhere where the horses can spend time when they're not actually grazing. You've got to have somewhere where you can remove that grazing pressure so that the pasture gets time to rest and recuperate, so that there'll be more pasture in the future and that kind of thing. So you need somewhere for the horses to carry out a lot of that hanging around behaviour, which they will do anyway. Even in the natural situation, they'll spend many hours just standing under a tree or whatever. So, but as much as possible, we need to remove that behaviour from the pasture, unless we have thousands of acres, which most of us don't. So therefore, because most of us don't, we need somewhere to do that. So those kind of areas, there's all sorts of names and so on, but you could create like a sacrifice area. To my way of thinking, a sacrifice area is good as well, what I tend to think of a sacrifice area is a temporary area. So it might be somewhere where the horses where you put them temporarily whilst you're building some good dry lots, basically. What you would call a dry lot here, I would call a yard. But basically, so a sacrifice area is just a temporary sort of solution. In the end, you need to end up with a good yard or dry lot that has a surface on it. That's what you need to be aiming for. And again, depending on your soil type, it might be that you only need to surface a certain part of that, or you might need to surface all of it, and so on. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. All depends on how wet it is.
But if you have enough pasture, and say like I've subdivided ours, they can just live in the pasture if the pressure on the pasture is...
Absolutely. Yeah. If you have enough land for the amount of horses you've got, but the only trouble is, if you have enough land, chances are, sometimes you might have horses who you need to actually remove from the land at a certain time just to control their intake. But if you're lucky enough that it all works out, but it usually doesn't, because there'll be times when, for instance, they might be getting too much pasture, you know, or if the laminitic horses or whatever, you might have to control their intakes. But there's other ways of doing that as well, like grazing muzzles, which I'll talk about later on. Sorry?
And then we're using all native grasses too, so that would help with that intake that you're talking about. It's not going to be...
You know what, sorry, I have to look at this.
The native grasses will help with
absolutely, yeah, that's it. But again, you've got to make sure you're never actually overgrazing those grasses as well. Sure. Sometimes, like if you have enough land and the right kind of horses, you might not need yards at all. But on most horse properties, you have too many animals for the amount of land you've got. So that's where yards become more and more important. But after today, you know, you might find that you think about it differently, but then again, you might be fine with what you've got already. So, yeah, so stables with walk in, walk out, paddocks, I think you call them, off the back, we call them yards, are one way of going. But if you don't have stables, just a yard surface with a bit of a shelter in it is absolutely fine. You don't have to have stables unless you want them. Because for horses, the more open the building is, the more they like them, basically. They quite like having a roof over their head, but they prefer not to be in a building that's too enclosed. So stables, in hot climates, stables should be light and airy. So this kind of building, even though it's stables, it'd be far preferable to something with solid walls. So just as a by the way, these, what I don't know if you call them in here, but in Australia we actually call them American barns, where the ones where you get, yeah, I don't know whether you call that here, but those where you get the stables down either side, and the aisle up the middle, would you call those?
Breezeway barn.
Yeah. Well, those stables are actually developed from really cold countries like Sweden, and the reason they were developed is not for horses' comfort, but for human comfort. Because what they allow is people to work up the aisleway there, but they'd be solid buildings, in sort of minus 30, 40 degrees and so on. The horses are on the outside of the building, usually have doors leading out into yards, or can at least get their heads out and so on. The aisleway is just so that humans can manage the horses without freezing to death. Because the horses can cope with the cold climate. As humans, we struggle a bit more with the cold. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. So a yard can be for a couple of horses. So this is just an example in the UK where they have all sorts of problems with mud and that kind of thing as well. So yards don't have to be for individual horses. There's pros and cons and so on, but if you've got quiet horses and they get on well enough, as long as there's enough space, then the yards can be communal yards. So in this case here, we've got an even bigger yard. Sorry, it's a bit light, that picture, but there's actually about 5 or 6 horses in that larger area there, with a surface on it, because this is on a very small horse property with very little pasture. So the horses spend a fair bit of time in this yard, and then it means that they can completely control their grazing pressure. But it means that when they do go out, that they're actually going out for quality grazing time. Whereas if they instead had that all as pasture, it would, by now it would be totally overgrazed.
Australia's lovely eucalyptus trees.
Sorry?
You guys have the eucalyptus trees.
Yeah, they're virtually all eucalyptus trees.
Very familiar with them.
Yeah, that's right. There's actually a few too many of them in Australia as well, because they actually become a monoculture in a lot of areas where, because fire actually favours them, so we end up with too many of them. So in this case here, this is that same big yard, but the horses have always got access to hay, and they just come and help themselves to it on an all-you-can-eat basis. And they're quite happy then to spend time in this larger area, as long as they have access to hay, spending time in there. And all that time is removing that hoof pressure. So horses can sleep and eat any supplementary feed, and all the time they're giving the pasture a break. So as much as we can, if we can remove that pressure, it makes a huge difference in how much pasture we can grow. And at the end of today's talk, as I say, I'll actually talk about how the horses will voluntarily remove themselves and apply pressure and so on. I know it sounds intriguing, and it is, but I'll come back to that later on. So when horses are confined, they need lots of fibre, so we've got to keep up that fibre intake. Even fat horses still need lots of food, but they need more of the salad variety of food and less of the chocolate variety of food, if you think of it that way. So when you have a fat horse, try not to think in terms of I've got to feed him less. Think of I've got to find him some lower energy food, because in the wild that's what he would have access to.
Would alfalfa be on the high sugar side?
It's sort of on the chocolate variety. Alfalfa is actually, in some ways, it's not actually that high in sugar, but it's high in everything. It's really high quality food. And again, if you think about it, think about a horse in the wild, he would never have access to that kind of food. He would be eating the equivalent of just your native pasture hay. So a small amount of alfalfa is certainly not going to harm a horse, but if that's, like in Australia in particular, we call it lucerne in Australia, but in Australia, many horses, that is the only fibre they get. So they've fed on really small amounts of it, so that means that they spend many, many hours with nothing to eat, and then we get colic issues and so on. So I thought it was funny once when I came across a really well-known dressage rider over there, and she said, oh, I'm feeding this new European diet. And I said, what's that? She said, oh, it's where we actually give them grass hay and they eat it all night long. That's what I was brought up on. You know, our horses just eat hay, because, for instance, in the UK, really, really wet all winter, so our horses were stabled often all winter long. But the way, and you'll understand this as well, they just fed hay in big, you know, we put like 2 or 3 massive hay nets in a stable, and then the next morning when you went in there, there would still be hay left. That's how much hay they had. But because it was just ordinary pasture hay, you know, this is in the days before we started getting so much improved hay as well, then, you know, the horses didn't suffer from things like crib biting, weaving. They always had fibre to eat. And then when they'd run out of that hay, they were usually bedded on straw as well. So if they ran out of hay, they just started on the straw. So they always had access to fibre. Whereas in modern times, they don't. And that's when they start eating everything else. They start getting colic.
Could you comment on, there's a new trend that seems to, in the last 5 years here in California, where they're feeding pellets and compressed feed
As their fibre?
as everything and nothing else.
Yeah, I don't like that fact.
So I'm just curious what your
Because the
thoughts
problem
on
is,
that.
because it's being chewed up for them, so basically, that's like what would the human equivalent? Basically, all the chewing has been done for them, so therefore, it doesn't take them very long to eat those pellets to get, you know, so they can get their feed requirements, but in a very small, you know, amount of food. So then that leaves hours with nothing to do. So it's not. I don't think it's a good way to go. Yeah. I mean, it's handy, for instance, if people are travelling long distances with horses, like if you were doing like a really long trail ride, that kind of things, because that would be a really good way to feed horses in that case, as well as especially if you could just let them pick at some grasses along the way as well. But that would be a good way of, you know, actually getting the fibre, travelling the fibre with them. But in the, you know, day-to-day situation, I'm not keen on that. Yeah.
What do you think of slow feeder nets?
Yeah, they're good. Yeah, and I'll be showing you a picture of some of those later on. So they're great, because again, what they're doing is making the horse take longer. So they're a really good way as well with horses that are too fat or whatever. It's all about trying to make it so that they still eat for a long time, but just try and slow them down a bit. Yeah. So keeping up the fibre, you know, is so important, especially in confined horses. They should be able to see and touch another horse whenever possible. You know, we shouldn't be keeping them in cages. They did a study recently in the UK where they got all these horse owners to stop using the word stable and start using the word cage, and it had an amazing effect on how they actually looked at how they kept their horses, because basically that's what it is. We are keeping them in cages, and if you did that to a zoo animal, people would have something to say about it. So we have to confine them to some extent, but if we think of it that way, we might think, you know, a bit more about how the horse might need some more stimulation. And again, if horses are confined, if they can actually interact with each other, they're going to be a lot happier than if they're in a cage and they also can't touch another horse and that type of thing. They should be exercised and turned out every day. So in a situation where, for instance, you can't turn horses out because paddocks are really wet, or as often happens in Australia, they get really, really dry because of a long drought, that's when you need to step in more and more and actually supervise their exercise. Because if you turn a horse out, for instance, just onto your arena, if it has a fence around it, and expect the horse to exercise himself, he will not do it. He'll run around for the first 5 minutes, then he'll stand at the gate asking you to let him back in to where the feed is, basically. He'll just stand there. Because horses are at the same time extremely energetic and extremely lazy, but there's no in-between. The only in-between comes when the horse is grazing. He doesn't walk for the fun of it, he walks simply because the grass doesn't walk. He has to move to where the grass is. The horse would be really happy if you put a conveyor belt in front of him, and all he had to do was stand there and eat it until they passed. That would suit him just fine. Doesn't walk because he loves walking, he walks because he has to go and get grass. So pasture management involves a twofold approach, utilising grazing systems and carrying out pasture maintenance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grazing systems, but if we possibly can, we should always look at keeping horses in herds, because the advantages of keeping them together usually far outweigh those of keeping them separated. We get fence injuries versus kicking injuries, but anybody who keeps horses in a herd situation will usually tell you that that is by far the safest way to do it. And then you're not getting anything like that amount of fence walking behaviour, hanging around gateways as much, and that type of thing as well.
Do you find that donkeys are adequate company for a horse?
So what, a donkey?
A donkey, another,
Yeah, good question. Donkey sort of is good enough. Like, they're pretty similar in the behaviour. I mean, they're another equine anyway. So donkeys are good because donkey's better than nothing, because a donkey will mutual groom with a horse and so on. But there's a picture a little bit later on, but I'll talk about it now, because people often ask me this question, is another animal good enough? And the answer is it's better than nothing, but the thing is different animals have very different behaviours. So I'll show you a picture later on which actually shows a cow and a horse that used to live in a paddock together, right near where we used to live in Queensland. And we got to observe these animals quite a bit because they were neighbours. And it was really interesting to watch them, because, for instance, cattle will lie down for about 8 hours a day to ruminate. So what does the horse do? As a good horse citizen, he stands there over the cow for that whole 8 hours a day while the horse is ruminating. So he stands there and does his job. But then when the cow has finished ruminating, he gets up and walks off to start grazing. He will never stand over the horse while the horse lays down. So the horse follows him out into the paddock, lays down, but when the horse wakes up, the cows disappear. The cows don't do that. The cow's not been let in on this kind of behaviour at all, so he just wanders off and does his thing. Cows leave their young in grass and just go off and graze. So in that respect, it wasn't really working. So it was sort of sad but funny, but what was really funny was that the horse used to walk up to the cow several times a day and force him to mutual groom. So the horse used to bite the cow, and the cow used to have to reciprocal groom with the horse, but obviously he could only use his tongue. So they used to reciprocal groom with each other, and the cow had absolutely no say in that whatsoever. He just had to do it. So on the one hand, so you can see how, because there's such a different animal, it was certainly better than being on their own. You know, they stuck together literally like glue, whereas if there'd been 2 horses and 2 cows, they would have lived completely separately because they don't really have much in common. But because they only had each other, they stuck together. But a donkey, being an equine, will still mutually groom and so on. So yeah, donkeys are pretty much okay, but ruminant animals are quite different. As I say, it's better than nothing, but really they need other equines. So the thing is, natural progression means that you start with one horse, and then you get one horse to keep that first horse company, but then you quickly realise that the problem is that now you need something to keep the second horse company when you take the first horse out of the line. So often we end up with 3 horses anyway. That's usually, on a small horse property, we often very quickly get to that number of having 3 horses. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And possible complications when it comes to mixing groups of horses are things like too many males and too few females. As somebody pointed out to me, this happens in the Navy as well. So if you have a herd of horses, and for instance you've got, say, 4 geldings and 1 mare, usually that won't work because the geldings all want their own mare. So if you have equal numbers, it might work, but it doesn't usually work. You've got 4 geldings and 1 mare. Sometimes it will, but often it doesn't. Whereas the other way round, it usually works fine. So if you've got 4 mares and 1 gelding, that works absolutely fine. And that's because in the wild, that's a natural grouping. You'll get a stallion, and he'll have 5 or 6 mares, and then all the other males form what's called a bachelor group. So they'll live as a group of males. So that's something to keep in mind. If you've got uneven numbers, you may end up with 2 herds, for instance, one of all males, and one where you've got a gelding, say, with your group of mares or whatever. But sometimes you can mix the whole lot. You've just got to try out different groupings, because as much as possible, you want to end up with just 1 herd of horses if you can, because then it becomes much easier in terms of land management, as I'll explain later. A very young old combination doesn't always work, and what I'm meaning by that is when a horse gets very old. You need to, when you've got old horses, you need to be watching them on a daily basis, because it will very quickly flip from a situation where the old horse is doing really good with the young horses and is keeping them in check and is actually a really good influence on the young horses, and one day it will just be that he just gets too old, so he needs removing for his sake at that point, because again, remember that horse would not get to that age in the wild situation. It would have been picked off by a predator. It wouldn't get to be 35 in the wild situation. So if you've got a really old horse with boisterous young horses, it might just be a bit too much for him. So keep that in mind as well. Recycled racehorses, as we call them in Australia, I don't know what we call them here, but ex-race horses who are turned into riding horses, they can often have issues initially learning how to live in a herd again. Because they've often been separated from very young, so they've missed out on learning all about the really important social skills. So then when we reintroduce them to be with other horses, it can take them a while to actually learn. But it's not just recycled racehorses, it's other horses as well. But it happens a lot with thoroughbreds and standardbreds when they're recycled into riding horses. So spend time letting horses get to know each other, introducing them in adjacent yards and so on is usually a good way to go. And then eventually you can introduce them into a herd situation. And then it means that you can start to utilise grazing systems much better. Now the one system that we shouldn't be using, which is commonly used on horse properties, is what's called set stocking. So that basically means that all of the land is in use all of the time. That situation will only work if you own hundreds of thousands of acres. So basically your horses are living like wild horses. And in that situation you wouldn't usually just have horses either, you would have cattle and so on. So in that situation set stocking can work. But anything smaller than that, like most of us, there's hardly anybody who has access to such large areas, set stocking doesn't work because it means that all of the land is getting pressure all of the time. I'll go into this in a lot more detail. So basically we should be using rotational grazing, that's the main system. And then we can add to that limited grazing, and I'll talk about all these in a lot more detail. Possibly strip grazing as well, which is where you might call it something different, but basically where you're using an electric fence to reduce the grazing area. And you may even be using what we call cross grazing. It all depends on how much land you have and so on, but basically that's where you're using other animals. And I'll go into some of the pros and cons of that as well. So rotational grazing basically means that you're putting the horses onto the land when the grass is a certain length, but you're removing them when the grass has been grazed down to a certain length. I'll talk about those lengths in a minute. That's basically all that rotational grazing is. Rather than having the horses going out day after day after day and overgrazing, well, eventually they'll overgraze the pasture, but not just that, they'll overgraze certain areas and they'll ignore other areas if you don't do this. So I'll talk about that in more detail. What we're doing when we do rotational grazing is we're trying to copy what actually happens to pasture in the wild. Now, pasture grasses and grazing animals have what's called a symbiotic relationship, basically. Grasses, believe it or not, thrive on being grazed. It's just that in the domestic situation, we tend to overgraze them. But if you don't graze grasses, that's not good for them either. So, for example, if you had a paddock and you let it all, a pasture, you let it all go to seed, and you lock it up and you say, I'm going to rest that pasture for 5 years. 5 years later, there'll be absolutely no more pasture in that paddock than the day you locked it up. Because that pasture needs cutting back. It needs grazing or cutting back with a machine to actually kick-start and regrow itself, because pasture needs that. Again, in the wild, think about it, nobody locks an area up and stops it from being grazed. Animals will continuously graze over that area. So pasture, it's really important that it is grazed. It's just that it needs the right amount of grazing pressure. And in the domestic situation, that is virtually always what we tend to do is overgraze it. But I'll be talking about how we can get around that. So what happens to grasses in the wild is that animals move across the landscape and they're always moving forwards. They're not going around in tiny little circles, they're always moving forwards. And as they graze, they're taking a bite of the plant, moving on. As they step across the landscape, they're creating little gaps in between the plants with their hard hooves. The manure that contains seeds of grasses that they ate in the last 2 or 3 days drops into those gaps between the plants. Because the plants have all been cut back to a relatively level area, the sunshine can get to the base of those plants, and some of those seeds that drop into those little gaps get their chance and actually get a chance to grow into a new plant. So that is how biodiversity is created as well, because what's happening is seeds are being brought in from other areas and dropped into this area that the animals are currently grazing. So we end up with a high level of what's called biodiversity. We end up with lots of different plants in that area, in the natural situation. So in the domestic situation, what we're trying to do is copy that. And obviously we can't copy it totally, but we need to aim to copy that, because that's what grasses thrive on, and that's what our grazing animals thrive on. Whereas in the domestic situation, what we're doing generally is turning the horse out every single day onto the same area, whether it's rained for the last 6 weeks or it hasn't rained for the last 6 weeks, and just expecting the pasture to cope with that grazing regime. So it's not surprising that we end up with highly stressed pastures and so on. So I'll be going into how grazing systems will actually bring you closer to copying what happens in the wild situation. And when you do that, you will end up with a lot more pasture. That's how it works. So we need to abide by what's called the 30% rule, and this is just as a minimum. In fact, after what I'm about to explain, after you've gone through that, you'll be able to see how, if you can keep your horses as one herd, if you like, you can actually get it so that only 5 or 10% of your land is in use at any one time, and you'll start to see the massive benefits you get from doing that. But as I say, as a minimum, aim for only 30% of your land to be in use, which means then that the rest of the land is getting to rest and recuperate. Basically, it's growing more pasture, which means then that there'll be more pasture in the future. So that's the 30% rule. So basically, it means that you've got, for instance, one pasture in use, and the others are locked up and getting chance to rest and recuperate. That's the 30% rule. But we can make it so that it's even more fine-tuned than that quite easily. So as I said, rotational grazing increases biodiversity, because what's happening is, instead of allowing, and horses in particular do this, as I said, they go back over the same plants again and again, because once they make them sure, they like them like that. So then they start grazing those same plants again and again, and only the plants that can cope with that kind of pressure end up surviving, and everything else tends to die out. So we end up with a monoculture in our paddocks, basically. The grasses that can cope with that overgrazing, which are often also the grasses that get selected as lawn grasses and golf course grasses, that type of thing, they're the only ones that survive, whether we like it or not, if we have our horses continuously grazing the same area. But once we start to move the horses around, just as the horses are getting the grasses to that stage where they really like them, because they're high in sugar, we move them on again to the next pasture. So they're able to be less selected then, and so therefore many different types of plants get a chance to have their day as well. So that's one way of thinking of it. Also, it decreases parasitic worms on your pasture, because what happens with worms is that and it won't get rid of all of them, but it helps. So what happens with worms is that when they hatch out into the next stage, the larval stage, and climb a piece of grass and just hope and pray that a horse comes along and eats that particular piece of grass. But if you're rotationally grazing, the chances are the horses are no longer in that pasture, they're now in another one. So the larvae, if there's any hot, dry sunshine comes along, some of the larvae will actually get killed out in that situation. Frost can kill some of them as well, but hot, dry sunshine is better than frost. So rotational grazing means you'll end up with less worms on your pasture as well. So it's one way of controlling worms. And again, in the wild situation, nobody goes along and worms the animals. They have their own worm control mechanisms, and it's cross-grazing, and the equivalent of rotational grazing, which helps to control their worms. That's why they don't usually die of worm infestations, is because they're doing their own worm control. So biodiversity is vital for many other reasons. So plants need other variety of plants. Plants have symbiotic relationships, many of which we don't even understand yet. But we know that when plants live in a biodiverse situation, they do better. So like the new, well, relatively new idea of, in fact it's probably not new, it's just something that's thought of as new, but it's an old practice where we actually now plant certain plants in with existing plants, because it's found that they actually help each other to grow. That's just an extension of that. Plants actually do better when they're alongside other plants. Plants need a variety of animals, including insects, to carry out their life cycle, because insects do things like pollinate them and all sorts of things. So we need that variety of insects. Animals and insects need a variety of plants in turn. So again, it's that reciprocal relationship. And horses need to graze a wide variety of plants. So in the wild situation, they reckon horses select and graze around 80 different plant species on a daily basis. In the domestic situation, some horses eat as little as 1 or 2 plant species.
I feel like I might have seeded too many forbs in my pasture.
Yeah.
But it sounds like, and you keep on saying grass, grass, grass,
Yeah,
but
sorry,
now you're saying...
a mixture of pasture. I should say pasture. Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
forbs are
Yeah,
good.
really good. Yeah, yeah, all sorts of, the big variety of plants. So pasture plants, yeah, includes things like forbs, herbs, grasses, all sorts of things.
Some
Yeah.
brush, you even said they eat some blackberries and stuff in the wild?
Yeah, in the UK, they have no choice in the winter. They actually survive on blackberry and gorse. But I don't know about here in Australia, they're highly invasive, really big weed problems. So whereas in the UK, they're native to those areas. So yeah, it wouldn't be.
So the browsing's last option. Basically.
Yeah, it seems to be. They'll eat the fruit. They're quite happy to go along and eat the fruit. But the actual parts of the plant, the woodier parts of the plant, are something they'll leave until later. Yeah, but I mean, horses love, for instance, the thistle heads of thistle, like the Scotch thistle. They'll walk along and they can curl the lips back and eat the heads off thistle. They like that kind of thing. So they do eat a wide variety of plants, and some of them just at certain times of the year, depending on how desperate they get or whatever. But that's what they would eat in the wild. So increasing biodiversity is a win-win situation. It helps everything. And that's what we want to create on our property, that high level of biodiversity. So we need to be aware of the plant stages of growth. So basically, when grasses are very short, so less than 2 inches, generally speaking, although all different plants go to flower or go to seed at different heights and so on, so I'm just talking generally here, but when they're around 2 inches, then at that stage they're usually struggling. If you still graze them at that level, they will struggle to regrow and be grazed at the same time and so on. So when your plants get to that height, then that's when you're starting to overgraze the pasture. Whereas when you think about many horse pastures, they're grazed much lower than that. And sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's because we don't know any differently or whatever. When plants are in the next stage, so when they're sort of between 2 and 8 inches, that's when they're rapidly growing. So in this stage, even though it's often been thought that this is when the plants are at their most dangerous for horses to graze, and this is where it can take a little bit of getting your head around it, in many ways the plants are actually safer at this stage because the sugar that's in the plant is actually spread over a longer distance. The horse actually has to eat more of that plant to put the same amount of weight on. However, if our horse is in a pasture of really good grasses and so on, and he's not doing anything else, he doesn't have to travel very far to get that pasture and so on, he will still get overweight and get laminitis on those grasses. But what I'm saying is, he actually has to eat more of them to get fat on them because there's more fibre in there, more water, more everything, and the sugar is spread over a larger distance. But that doesn't mean your horse is not going to get laminitis turning out on grass like this, because remember, he's got a lot more time on his hooves than a wild horse would have, in terms of what I mean is he's just standing there and it's all right there just in front of him. He doesn't have to travel very far to get it. When the grasses go to seed, that's called the reproductive stage. As I said, when grasses get to that level, unless you actually graze them or cut them back with a machine, you don't get any more pasture after that point. They've finished growing, they've gone to seed, they have to be cut back, and that's all that a mowing or a slasher machine does, is it copies what a grazing animal does. It cuts them all back, and it restarts that growing period. So that's how you get more grass. So mowing is actually good. So again, if you end up with too much grass, then that's great, because you just spend more time, you know, a little bit of, takes a bit of time, but you will make a lot more organic matter and so on for your soil.
So when the pasture gets really long like that, or gets seed heads, is it bad to put the horse out, or is it okay?
No, not necessarily.
Because
There's pros and cons. Like for instance, if you have a pasture and it's all gone to seed, it all depends on whether they're plants that you want or plants that you don't want. So for instance, if you were trying to recreate some native pasture, it's a really good idea to occasionally let it all go to seed, let it drop some seed and then cut it back or graze it back, and then after the animals have been in there, cut it back. If, for instance, you've got a problem type of grass, aim to never let it go to seed. So it all depends on what you've got in there.
Right.
If you've got lots of weeds, you know, try and aim to cut them back before they go to seed, that kind of thing. They can still have some beneficial effects, but don't let them actually go to seed, in that weeds have a long taproot, so they can often really open your soil and so on, but don't let them go to seed, otherwise then there's just going to be more of them. So yeah, but if you've got paddocks, if you've got plenty of pasture, another way of looking at it, what some people do is they'll actually let a paddock go to seed and think of it as, say, standing hay for the winter. That's another, if you've got plenty of pasture. Because it's quite a wasteful way in terms of, if you turn the horses out in there, they'll trample a lot as well as graze it. But still, it doesn't matter that they've trampled it in terms of, that's great for your soil, because you're just, again, knocking all that organic matter back down onto your soil. But you won't get quite as much feed value out of that pasture as if you went in and cut it and baled it and fed it to them. But then again, it's saving you having to do that. So just weighing all those types of things up. If you've got lots of land, standing hay can be a really good way, you know, to actually lock paddocks up and let the horses go and get their own hay in the winter. So there's various ways of looking at it. There's no harm in letting the horses graze it, apart from some seed heads can be quite high in sugar. The sugar actually comes up to the seed head. So if you've got fat horses that are really at risk of laminitis, horses will walk around just eating the seed heads off, so just watch those kind of horses. But your average sort of horse is okay grazing that type of grass usually.
If you're trying to get rid of invasive weeds
Yeah.
that seem to grow faster, go to seed faster,
Yeah.
can you raise your horse to get rid of those seeds, compost your manure to heat it up, or are you just going to end up replanting the seed from manure that you...
If you compost manure properly, if you do it thoroughly, it is meant to kill out most weed seeds. So yeah, composting your manure will help with weed seeds. So sorry, was that your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to
But it
get
needs to
rid
be
of
thoroughly
those.
composted. But just with those weeds, just try and make it so they never get to go to seed. Yeah, try and cut them back before they go to seed. Yeah. But composting does help.
What's the timeline for growth here?
So that's, again, hugely varies. I think the next slide might even talk, yeah. So for instance, in a wet, if it's warm, wet and sunny, then grass can, you know, in a couple of weeks, the paddock can go from like this to like this. In a drought or a frosty time, for instance, in a temperate climate such as this, there'll be some grasses that don't grow for 6 months, because once the nighttime temperatures get below a certain temperature, that's it, they stop growing for the whole winter. So again, if we keep turning our horses out on those kind of grasses, they're going to get more and more overgrazed. So again, in that case, if we can, it's good to have a mix of grasses, some that will grow in those colder times, and some that will grow more in the summer, that kind of thing. So, I mean, obviously I can't really talk too much about grasses here because I'm not, aware of what types of grasses you have here, but there will be some grasses that are warm season and some that are cold season, and some that do better in those colder times. So yeah, it's like how long is a piece of string here, because they'll all take different amounts of time to recover. So good grazing management is about manipulating grazing systems to keep grasses in that stage 2 for as long as possible, because that's going to create more organic matter for your land. Therefore, graze a pasture when it's reached an average height of around 6 to 8 inches, and rest it when it's been grazed down to an average height of 2 to 4 inches. That's a general rule of thumb. So this is going to mean quite quick rotations. And just to give you an example, now in a lot of farms where they're aiming to grow as much grass as possible, and I'm not saying we should do this as horse owners because it would be too labour intensive, but just to give you an idea of how it works, on some of these larger farms now, what they're actually doing is moving cattle every day onto a fresh pasture. So that's, you know, that's because by doing that, that's how they produce more grass. So that's what we're aiming for. But obviously we're not going to aim to move our whole. But saying that, strip grazing across the pasture will come close to that, where you move the fence every day. So but by doing that, you will end up with more grass, because it means that more of the land is spending more time in that rest and recuperation phase, growing more grass. But there's times of the year when it won't do anything at all. But still, if you keep grazing the animals over that grass, once it stops growing, all that's happening is you're overgrazing that land.
And
So
it's giving it a higher animal impact for a shorter period of time.
that's right. Again, because that's what happens in the wild. Huge numbers of animals, but so grasses thrive on high levels of stress for a really short period of time, or pasture plants. Whereas what we tend to do on most horse farms or whatever is we stress the grasses at a lower rate but continuously.
That's kind of my problem, I think. I only have 2 horses,
Yeah,
and I have
a large area.
large areas, so how do I get the competition for them to
Yeah,
kind of...
fencing basically, electric fencing. Yeah, subdividing with
Yeah.
like the equivalent of strip grazing and so on, so that you're forcing them into a smaller area and
Right,
making them do that
which
more.
with 2 horses is a
Yeah.
kind
Yeah, it might be difficult if you've just got one large area. Yeah. So basically it's about getting the horses in there when the grass is a certain length, but eyeballing the paddock and taking them out when those grasses have been eaten down to an average length. So good grazing management is also about aiming to provide a similar quality and quantity of feed for your animals for as long as possible. So by having good grazing management, it means the grasses last for a lot longer period throughout the year rather than overgrazing them, so that there's nothing left for the rest of the year. But keep in mind that the time it takes a pasture to recover varies with the climate, the grass species, the time of year, and therefore you need to be flexible. So it doesn't work, for instance, to divide your property into 12 paddocks and say I'm going to graze every paddock for a long and then move them on. You have to be a lot more flexible than that, because there'll be some years when that might work, there'll be other seasons, for instance, when it definitely doesn't work, and so on. It's about looking at the pasture and moving the animals on as and when you need to do. So limited grazing is where you're still rotating your paddocks, but you're using those confinement areas to limit the grazing pressure so that the available pasture lasts longer, also so that to some extent you control their intake. But remember that horses must have access to hay when they're not grazing. But by giving them access to the hay, you're making it so the grass will last longer throughout the year. So with limited grazing though, you need to keep in mind that diet paddocks don't really work. So I don't know if we call them here, but in Australia we call them Jenny Craig paddocks. And I noticed that you actually have Jenny Craig here, so you understand what I mean. Yeah. Diet paddocks don't really work and they create land degradation. So this picture here, I don't know if you can see that we've got a small pony on this smaller area, thinking that that will reduce his intake, and the bigger horse out on the larger area. So, because people often think that that will mean he'll get less grass, but it doesn't at all. That's why you can't see this picture here, but that pony is twice as fat as the big horse anyway. But people just think that, well, he's on a smaller area, surely it will make a difference, but it doesn't make any difference at all. In fact, it makes him even fatter because he's travelling less distance and he's eating shorter, more concentrated grasses. So diet paddocks don't really work. And it also means that these ponies that are forced into these overgrazed pastures end up eating plants that normally they wouldn't dream of eating. So they often end up eating poisonous weeds and so on, because they also need that variety. So when they're forced to overgraze these really short pastures, they'll often eat weeds as well that they wouldn't normally eat. This is a picture of a horse he's actually only 21 years old, and this is what happens to horses when they spend their whole life grazing stressed overgrazed pasture. What they end up doing is depends on the soil type and the grass type and so on, but they end up wearing out the front teeth completely. So this horse, what I find interesting is that, because I'm going to be talking about grazing muzzles in a minute, grazing muzzles are actually, people are starting to say the trouble is they wear the teeth unevenly. This horse has never worn a grazing muzzle, he's just spent his life on a diet paddock. He's a Frisian cross, so he was a Frisian pony cross in the UK. I used to own him when he was much younger. He now belongs to a friend of mine. Took this picture last year when we went to visit him. So I know about his management ever since he was sort of 2 years old. And it's very interesting what's actually happened to his teeth. And you see a lot of this with horses who've spent their lives grazing very short grass. So basically, he's been kept in a Jenny Craig paddock virtually all his life, thinking that it would reduce his intake and keep him slim. But what's happened is he's just literally eaten down to the ground and worn his teeth away. So that's typical of what happens with these kind of horses. But as I say, grazing muzzles are getting blamed for that, but I actually think that the kind of horses people putting grazing muzzles on have probably already got this kind of tooth damage because they've already been on these genuine products all their life and so on. So they did a pasture intake study last year or the year before in the UK. Basically, what they were looking at, because what I'm about to say now is, the problem is when we lock our horses in yards, we often think we're reducing our horses' intake, whereas what's actually happening might be quite different. So what they actually did is, they looked at the grass intake of 4 mature ponies that weren't doing anything over a 6-week period on reasonably good quality grass. So first of all, they just monitored them by just letting them graze 24/7 to see what happened. So what happened was that over this 6-week period, the ponies were gaining an average of around about a kilo a day, so 2.2 pounds a day, which is normal. That's what, in the wild, that's what a horse is doing. He spends the whole summer putting weight on so that he survives the winter when there's snow on the ground and so on, and he can utilise that body fat that he's spent all summer building up. These ponies were on relatively good grass, so they were putting on, you know, a lot of weight a day. So that's a huge amount of weight on a daily basis, a kilo or 2.2 pounds on a daily basis. So that was their control, if you like. They wanted to see what the horses did if they had free access to pasture. Then they started looking at, they wanted to compare grazing muzzles with horses not using grazing muzzles to see if they controlled the horse's intake. So they compared horses, as I say, wearing grazing muzzle. A grazing muzzle, if you haven't come across them before, they have a hole in the bottom there. So what they do is they just make it so the horse can get less grass. They can still graze, but they get less grass. So they compared the two. So what happened is, what they did is they put the ponies in yards for 23 hours a day, I think it was, and they let them graze for 3 hours a day. So some of them didn't have a grazing muzzle on, and some of them did have a grazing muzzle on for that 3-hour period that they were turned out. When they were in yards, they still had access to hay. The ponies that were let out without grazing muzzles on, in that 3-hour period, over the 6-week study, went from eating a reasonable amount up to eating 1% of their body weight in that 3-hour period. Now, when you think that if a horse should be on about 1.5 to 3% of his body weight a day off feed. So in 3 hours, they were managing to still eat 1% of their body weight in that 3-hour period. So basically what was happening was the ponies were learning that they were only going out on the grass for 3 hours, so they better eat really fast and stuff themselves stupid, because in 3 hours' time they would be put back in the yard. Because over the 6-week period, that amount, as I say, increased to that sort of 1% of the body weight. Because they learned the times they were getting let out, and they learned to overeat in that period. So this is something we need to be well aware of, is that we think when we lock horses up, we're reducing their intake, but in fact all that we're actually doing is creating eating disorders, if you like. We're actually because their behaviour is telling them that they need to put weight on. So when we try and do things to stop them doing that, they just come up with other strategies instead to make sure they still put weight on. The ponies that were wearing grazing muzzles, they actually had an average reduction of 83%. So the grazing muzzles did make a massive difference. So grazing muzzles, so as I say, 3 hours without a muzzle averaged an intake of almost 1%. 3 hours grazing with a muzzle resulted in an average reduction of 83%, so a massive reduction in their intake. So grazing muzzles can work really well for these kind of problematic kind of horses, but we need to be aware that the horses, the grasses need to be of a decent length so that they can actually get the grass through the muzzle. Horses can literally starve with them on otherwise, and so on. So we still need to be careful using them, but for those really problematic horses, they are probably the way to go, because it means the horse can still go out and graze with the other horses, rather than be fast and locked up all the time with not much to eat. I really don't like the whole idea of starving horses. It just sets up lots and lots of problems. If nothing else, it sets up much more risk of colic. So things like when you're feeding these horses on hay, as you were saying earlier about the hay nets, these are those slow feeders. So things like hay nets with smaller holes in, Soaking hay in water can get a lot of the sugar out. If it's grass hay, it can get quite a bit of sugar out, so that's another way to go as well. Have a look on our website for links to more information about obesity, laminitis and so on. We've got some cards there, but basically our website is equiculture.com.au. So, as I'll talk a little bit about my website at the end, but basically there's a huge amount of information on there. We're always looking for the results of all sorts of different studies and so on to do with these subjects and sustainability and so on. So you'll be able to keep up with a lot of the things we're finding out. So strip grazing.